It started in the most mundane of ways, with a chance meeting at a bookstore. I was wandering through the aisles, running my fingers along the spines of novels, when I noticed him. He stood out, not just because he was older, but because there was something quietly confident about the way he carried himself. "Looking for anything in particular?" he asked, his voice warm and measured. I looked up, caught off guard. "Just browsing," I replied. He smiled, holding up a book. "This one's a favorite of mine," he said. "A good read when you're looking for something meaningful." I glanced at the title. It was an old classic, one I'd always meant to read but never had. "Thanks," I said, taking it from him. We chatted for a few minutes, about books, the weather, and the little cafe next door that made the best lattes in town. His name was David, and there was something about him that felt different. He wasn't in a hurry, wasn't distracted. He gave me his full attention, and I found myself drawn to him in a way I couldn't quite explain. Over the next few weeks, I kept running into David at the bookstore. At first, I thought it was a coincidence, but eventually, it became clear that we were both drawn to the same space for similar reasons. "You must love this place as much as I do," he joked one afternoon. "It's my escape," I admitted. "A place where I can just breathe." "Exactly," he said, nodding. "There's something comforting about being surrounded by stories." We started talking more, our conversations growing longer and more personal. I learned that he was a professor, that he traveled to places I'd only dreamed of, and that he had a way of seeing the world that made everything feel more interesting. One day, after chatting for nearly an hour, David suggested we grab a coffee at the cafe next door. I hesitated, something about the idea felt slightly dangerous, but curiosity got the better of me. As we sat across from each other, the conversation flowed effortlessly. He asked me about my life, my dreams, the things that made me happy. "No one's asked me that in years," I said, surprised by my own admission. "They should," he said, his gaze steady. That moment felt like the beginning of something I didn't fully understand but couldn't ignore. At first, I told myself it was harmless. Coffee dates turned into walks in the park, and our conversations became more intimate. David had a way of making me feel seen, like I was more than just the roles I played in my everyday life. One evening, as we walked through the city, he stopped and looked at me. "You're remarkable, you know that," he said softly. I laughed, trying to deflect. "I think you're giving me too much credit." "No," he said, his voice serious. "I mean it." Something shifted in that moment, a line crossed that we couldn't uncross. What followed was a whirlwind of emotions. I felt alive in a way I hadn't in years, but I also felt the weight of what I was doing. I was married, and while my relationship with my husband, Matt, had grown distant, it didn't justify what I was doing. Still, every time I tried to walk away from David, I found myself drawn back. "You're different," I told him one evening. "And so are you," he replied. The turning point came when Matt found a note David had written me. It wasn't explicit, but it was enough to raise questions I wasn't ready to answer. "Who's David?" Matt asked, holding up the note. "He's just a friend," I said, my voice unsteady. Matt's expression was a mix of confusion and hurt. "Since when do you have friends I don't know about?" I didn't know how to respond, and the silence that followed was deafening. After that confrontation, I knew I had to make a choice. David represented everything that felt fresh and exciting, but Matt was the person I'd built a life with. Late one night, as I lay awake beside Matt, I whispered, "I'm sorry." He didn't respond, but I hoped that somewhere in his sleep, he heard me. The days after Matt found the note were heavy with tension. It was like a cloud had settled over our home, muting everything, conversations, laughter, even the sound of our footsteps. We didn't talk about it, not directly, but the unspoken weight of the situation was impossible to ignore. I thought about David constantly. The memory of his voice, his words, and the way he made me feel was like a whisper in the back of my mind, even as I tried to focus on my marriage. Matt and I fell into a strange rhythm of avoidance. He didn't press me about the note again, and I didn't volunteer any information. Instead, we pretended, sitting at the dinner table, asking about each other's day, watching TV in silence. But the cracks were there, widening with every moment we avoided the truth. One evening, as we sat on the couch, I caught him looking at me, his expression unreadable. "Are you happy, Caroline?" he asked. The question caught me off guard. "Why would you ask that?" I deflected. "Because it feels like you're not," he said softly. I opened my mouth to respond but couldn't find the words. A week later, I ran into David again. It wasn't planned. I was walking through the park on my lunch break when I saw him sitting on a bench, a book in his hands. For a moment, I considered walking away, but he looked up and saw me before I could make a decision. "Caroline," he said, his face lighting up. I hesitated, then walked over, my heart pounding. "Hi," I said. We talked for a while, our conversation as easy as it had always been. But this time, there was a tension beneath the surface, a question hanging in the air between us. "I miss you," he said finally, his voice quiet. "I can't do this," I replied, my throat tight. "It's not fair to anyone." His expression was calm but sad. "You deserve to be happy, you know that." I didn't respond. Instead, I stood and walked away, my heart aching with every step. That evening, I found Matt waiting for me in the kitchen. "Where were you?" he asked, his tone calm but pointed. "I went for a walk," I said, avoiding his gaze. "And did you see him?" he asked. My stomach dropped. "What are you talking about?" "You think I don't know?" he said, his voice rising. "You've been distant for weeks, Caroline." And then there was the note. "I've been giving you space, hoping you'd tell me the truth. But you haven't." The silence that followed was deafening. I started, but my voice faltered. "Do you love him?" Matt asked, his voice breaking. "No," I said quickly. "It's not like that." "Then what is it?" he asked, his frustration boiling over. "What does he have that I don't?" "It's not about that," I said, tears streaming down my face. "I don't even know why it happened. I felt invisible. And he made me feel seen." Matt's expression softened slightly, but the hurt in his eyes remained. "I see you, Caroline," he said quietly. "I've always seen you. But maybe I didn't show it enough." In the days that followed, Matt and I had some of the hardest conversations we'd ever had. He told me about the ways he felt I'd pulled away, and I admitted to feeling unfulfilled in our marriage. But instead of letting the distance between us grow, we decided to fight for what we had. "We've built a life together," Matt said one evening. "I don't want to lose that." "Do you?" "No," I said firmly. "I want to make this work. I'll do whatever it takes." The first step was letting go of David completely. I deleted his number, avoided the bookstore and the park, and committed myself to rebuilding the trust I'd broken. It wasn't easy. There were moments when I missed him, not just for who he was, but for how he made me feel. But I reminded myself that those feelings came from a place of insecurity, not love. Matt and I started seeing a couples therapist, someone who helped us navigate the pain and rebuild our connection. "I need to know that this won't happen again," Matt said during one session. "It won't," I promised. "I'm committed to us, Matt. I just need to figure out how to be better, for both of us." Our therapist encouraged us to focus on communication, vulnerability, and creating shared goals. It wasn't an overnight fix, but it was a start. Over time, Matt and I began to rediscover the connection we'd lost. We started spending more time together, going on date nights, taking weekend trips, and finding little ways to show each other we cared. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Matt took my hand. "We're going to be okay, aren't we?" he asked. Yes, I said, squeezing his hand. We are. The weeks after Matt and I committed to rebuilding our relationship were marked by cautious optimism. The pain of what had happened still lingered, but there was also a shared determination to move forward. Our home felt different now, not the comfortable but distant space it had become, nor the tense and heavy place it had been during the fallout. It was something in between, a work in progress. Couples therapy became a cornerstone of our rebuilding process. Our therapist, Dr. Hale, encouraged us to focus on honesty, even when it was uncomfortable. You need to create a space where you can share how you're feeling without fear of judgment or retaliation, she said during one session. At first, these conversations were difficult. Matt and I had both been holding on to so many unspoken frustrations, and airing them felt like ripping off a band-aid. I felt invisible for so long, I admitted one evening in therapy. I don't even know when it started, but it was like we were living side by side without really seeing each other. Matt nodded, his expression thoughtful. I guess I took for granted that you were always there, he said. And I didn't realize how much that hurt you. Hearing him acknowledge my feelings brought a wave of relief, and I began to understand how much healing could come from simply being heard. As part of our therapy, Dr. Hale encouraged us to find small ways to show each other we cared. It's not about grand gestures, she said. It's about creating moments of connection in your everyday lives. We started leaving little notes for each other, on the bathroom mirror, in lunch bags, on the nightstand. They were simple messages, good luck today or thinking of you, but they reminded us that we were in this together. One evening, I came home to find that Matt had made my favorite dinner. Just thought you could use a pick-me-up, he said with a shy smile. Moments like these felt like bricks in the foundation we were rebuilding, each one bringing us closer. Despite our progress, there were still moments when doubt crept in. Sometimes, Matt would grow quiet, and I'd wonder if he was replaying what had happened. Other times, I'd catch myself feeling unworthy of his forgiveness. During one particularly vulnerable moment, I said, "Do you think we'll ever get back to the way we were before?" Matt took my hand, his gaze steady. "I don't want to go back to the way we were," he said. "I want us to be better than that." His words gave me hope and reminded me that our journey wasn't about recreating the past, it was about building something new. One of the hardest parts of rebuilding our relationship was rediscovering intimacy. The emotional distance that had grown between us over the years didn't disappear overnight, and the affair had only added to the complexity. Dr. Hale encouraged us to take it slow, focusing on emotional intimacy before anything else. Intimacy starts with trust, she said. And trust is built through vulnerability and connection. We started by simply spending more time together, talking, laughing, and sharing our thoughts and feelings. Slowly, the walls between us began to come down, and the spark that had once defined our relationship started to return. As we continued to rebuild, Matt and I began to talk about our future in a way we hadn't in years. We dreamed about taking a trip to Europe, starting a garden in the backyard, and even adopting a dog. "We've been so focused on fixing the present," Matt said one evening. "It feels good to think about what's next." "Yeah," I agreed, smiling. "It feels like we're finally moving forward." One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Matt said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to be honest." "Of course," I said, my heart racing slightly. "Do you ever think about him?" he asked, his voice steady but serious. I hesitated, then said, "Sometimes. But not in the way you might think. I think about what it represented, how lost I felt and how I was looking for something I didn't even understand." Matt nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I don't want you to feel like you have to bury those feelings," he said. "But I need to know that you're here with me, not holding on to the past." "I am here," I said firmly. "And I'm not going anywhere." As the weeks turned into months, Matt and I began to feel the weight of the past lifting. We weren't perfect, and there were still moments of doubt and struggle, but we were learning to face them together. One evening, as we cooked dinner together, Matt said, I think we're doing okay, don't you? I smiled, nodding. I think we're doing more than okay, I said. In that moment, I realized how far we'd come, not just as a couple, but as individuals who had chosen to grow together. Trust isn't something you rebuild overnight. It doesn't come with a single apology or a grand gesture. For Matt and me, trust was something we had to reconstruct piece by piece, like a puzzle we hadn't realized we'd misplaced until it was nearly too late. In those months, we both learned to approach trust not as something granted freely, but as something earned through consistent actions, vulnerability, and honesty. Our therapist, Dr. Hale, emphasized the importance of transparency in our journey. Honesty isn't just about telling the truth when asked, she said. It's about sharing your thoughts and feelings proactively, even when it's uncomfortable. That advice stuck with me. I began making a conscious effort to share my thoughts with Matt, even the messy ones. One evening, as we sat on the couch, I said, I still feel guilty sometimes. Like I don't deserve this second chance. Matt looked at me, his expression softening. You don't have to be perfect, Caroline, he said. You just have to be honest. That's what matters. His words reminded me that trust wasn't about erasing the past, it was about proving, day by day, that we were committed to moving forward. To keep the lines of communication open, Matt and I developed a system of weekly check-ins. Every Sunday evening, we'd sit down together and talk about the week, what went well, what didn't, and how we were feeling about our relationship. These check-ins weren't always easy. There were moments of frustration, moments when old wounds resurfaced, and moments when I felt vulnerable in ways that were uncomfortable. But over time, they became a space where we could connect, reflect, and remind each other of our shared commitment. One of the biggest tests of our rebuilding journey came when Matt had the opportunity to attend a work conference out of town. It was a week-long trip, and it would be the first time we'd been apart for more than a day since the fallout. I want to go, Matt said one evening as we discussed the conference. But I don't want you to feel like I'm leaving you behind. You should go, I said, forcing a smile. It's important for your career. The truth was, I was nervous. The thought of being alone for a week, without the safety net of Matt's presence, was daunting. But I also knew that trust required letting go of control and believing in each other. While Matt was away, I focused on staying busy, painting, spending time with friends, and diving into work. We talked every evening, sharing the details of our days and reminding each other that distance didn't have to mean disconnection. When Matt returned, he brought back stories, photos, and a small gift, a delicate necklace with a tiny compass pendant. It's to remind you that we're always finding our way back to each other, he said, fastening it around my neck. As we moved forward, Matt and I made a conscious effort to create new memories together. We planned weekend getaways, tried new hobbies, and found joy in the everyday moments that made up our life. One Saturday, we decided to tackle a DIY project, building a bookshelf for our living room. It was chaotic, filled with mismatched screws and instructions we barely understood, but it was also fun. By the time we finished, the bookshelf was slightly crooked, but we didn't care. It's perfect, Matt said, laughing. Because we made it together. Despite our progress, there were still moments when doubt crept in. Sometimes, I'd catch Matt staring off into the distance, his expression thoughtful. Are you okay? I asked one evening as we sat on the porch. Yeah, he said after a moment. I was just thinking about how far we've come. Do you ever think about what happened? I asked hesitantly. Sometimes, he admitted. But not in the same way I used to. It doesn't hurt as much anymore. It just reminds me of how much we've grown. His words gave me a sense of relief I hadn't known I needed. As our relationship continued to strengthen, Matt and I began to dream about the future in a way we hadn't in years. We should plan a trip, he said one evening as we looked through photos of places we wanted to visit. Something big. Something that feels like a celebration. I'd love that, I said, my heart swelling with excitement. The idea of a trip felt symbolic, a way to mark how far we'd come and to embrace the possibilities of what lay ahead. One evening, as we sat by the fire, Matt turned to me and said, "Do you know what I'm most grateful for?" "What?" I asked, curious. "That we didn't give up," he said. "Even when it felt impossible." His words brought tears to my eyes, and I realized how much gratitude I felt, too, not just for Matt's forgiveness, but for the strength we'd found together. As we approached the 2-year mark of my confession, I realized that our relationship wasn't just repaired, it was transformed. The trust we'd rebuilt, the memories we'd created, and the dreams we'd begun to pursue had given us something stronger than what we'd had before. Matt and I weren't perfect, but we were partners in every sense of the word. And that, more than anything, felt like a victory. By the time we reached the 2-year mark of our rebuilding journey, our relationship had evolved into something neither of us had anticipated. It wasn't a return to what we had before, it was better. The trust we'd painstakingly rebuilt, the memories we'd created, and the growth we'd both undergone had transformed our marriage into something stronger and more intentional. Now, we weren't just living day to day. We were dreaming again, imagining a future that felt hopeful and bright. One of the biggest changes in our relationship was our renewed focus on shared goals. We talked about everything, from the mundane, like reorganizing the pantry, to the monumental, like starting a family. One evening, as we sat on the couch flipping through travel brochures, Matt said, "I think it's time we take that big trip we've been talking about." "Where should we go?" I asked, excitement bubbling up. "Somewhere we've never been. Somewhere that feels like an adventure," he said. We settled on a trip to Italy, a place we'd both always dreamed of visiting. Planning the trip became a project we tackled together, researching destinations, practicing Italian phrases, and daydreaming about the experiences we'd have. The trip to Italy was everything we'd hoped it would be. We explored cobblestone streets, marveled at ancient ruins, and indulged in food that was somehow both simple and extraordinary. But more than the sights or the meals, it was the quiet moments that stayed with me, the way Matt reached for my hand as we walked through a vineyard, the way we laughed over a language mishap in a tiny cafe, the way we talked late into the night in our cozy Airbnb, reflecting on how far we'd come. "This feels like a new beginning," Matt said one evening as we watched the sunset over the rolling hills of Tuscany. "It does," I agreed, my heart full of gratitude. When we returned home, we brought back more than souvenirs. We brought back a renewed sense of connection and a desire to create traditions that reflected the life we were building. One of those traditions became cooking Italian meals together every Sunday night. It was messy, chaotic, and full of laughter, just like our relationship. "This pasta might be the most crooked thing I've ever seen," Matt said one evening, holding up a misshapen ravioli. "But it's ours," I said, laughing. Moments like these reminded me of how much joy we'd found in the everyday. Life, of course, didn't stop presenting challenges. Work was demanding, family obligations piled up, and the occasional argument tested our patience. One evening, after a particularly stressful day, we found ourselves bickering over something trivial, the way I'd left the dishes in the sink. "It's not about the dishes," Matt said finally, his voice tired. "I know," I said softly. "It's about how overwhelmed we've both been." The argument ended not with anger, but with understanding. We sat together on the couch, talking about the stress we'd been feeling and finding ways to support each other better. As our relationship continued to strengthen, Matt and I began to talk more seriously about starting a family. "Do you think we're ready for that?" I asked one evening as we sat on the porch. "I don't think anyone's ever fully ready," Matt said with a smile. "But I do know that whatever happens, we'll figure it out together." His words gave me a sense of calm, and for the first time, the idea of becoming parents felt less overwhelming and more exciting. On the anniversary of my confession, Matt surprised me with a small celebration, a homemade dinner and a handwritten letter. In the letter, he wrote, "Caroline, these past 2 years have been a journey, one I wouldn't trade for anything. Thank you for your honesty, your courage, and your willingness to fight for us. We've built something stronger than I ever thought possible, and I'm so grateful for the life we're creating together. Here's to the future, whatever it may hold." His words brought tears to my eyes, and I realized how much we'd accomplished, not just in rebuilding our relationship, but in rediscovering the love that had always been there, waiting for us to nurture it. As we sat together that evening, toasting to the future, I felt a sense of peace and anticipation. Our journey wasn't over. There would always be challenges, moments of doubt, and opportunities to grow. But for the first time, I felt ready to face whatever came next. With Matt by my side, I knew we could handle anything. By the time we reached the third year of rebuilding our relationship, life had settled into a rhythm that felt both comfortable and full of promise. Matt and I had gone from surviving to thriving, finding joy in the everyday moments while dreaming about the future. But as we'd learned, life has a way of throwing curveballs, and how you face them says everything about the foundation you've built. The conversation about starting a family had shifted from an abstract, someday, to an active plan. One evening, as we prepared dinner, Matt brought it up again. "So," he said casually, chopping vegetables, "have you thought more about what we talked about? Starting a family?" I nodded, my heart fluttering. "I have. And I think I'm ready," I said, surprising even myself. "Me too," he said, his eyes lighting up. "Let's do this." From that moment, we embraced the idea of parenthood with equal parts excitement and nervousness. We spent evenings researching everything from baby names to prenatal vitamins, and I felt a new sense of connection as we envisioned this next chapter together. But life, as it often does, had other plans. Months went by without any news, and with each passing week, the hope we'd clung to began to waver. One evening, after yet another negative test, I broke down. "What if this doesn't happen for us?" I asked, tears streaming down my face. Matt pulled me into a hug, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "Then we'll figure it out," he said. "Together. No matter what." His reassurance reminded me that our strength as a couple wasn't tied to any single outcome. We'd faced challenges before, and we'd face this one, too. As the months went on, we decided to explore other options. We met with specialists, joined support groups, and even began discussing the possibility of adoption. Through it all, Matt remained my rock, reminding me that our worth as a couple wasn't defined by how quickly, or even if, we became parents. "Parenthood is one dream," he said one evening as we sat on the porch. "But it's not the only dream. And no matter what, I know our life will be full." His words gave me the strength to keep going, to approach the process with an open heart and a sense of possibility. Just when we'd begun to settle into this new mindset, life surprised us again. One morning, as I was tidying up the house, I noticed a box of pregnancy tests I'd forgotten about. On a whim, I decided to take one. I wasn't expecting anything, so when the second line appeared, I stared at it in disbelief. "Matt!" I called, my voice shaking. He rushed into the room, his face full of concern. "What's wrong?" I held up the test, unable to speak. His expression shifted from confusion to pure joy. "Are you serious?" he asked, his voice breaking. I nodded, tears streaming down my face. "I think so." We hugged tightly, both laughing and crying as the reality of what was happening began to sink in. The months that followed were a whirlwind of preparation and anticipation. We decorated the nursery, attended prenatal classes, and found ourselves talking late into the night about what kind of parents we wanted to be. "I want our child to grow up knowing they're loved unconditionally," Matt said one evening. "Me too," I said, smiling. "And I want them to see how much we love each other. To know what it looks like to fight for something that matters." The day our baby arrived was the most emotional and transformative experience of our lives. Holding our child for the first time, I felt a sense of awe and gratitude that words couldn't capture. Matt sat beside me, cradling our baby in his arms. "We did it," he said softly. "No," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "We're just getting started." Life as parents was chaotic, exhausting, and utterly beautiful. Late-night feedings turned into moments of quiet connection, and first smiles felt like tiny victories that made all the sleepless nights worth it. Through it all, Matt and I remained a team, supporting each other through the ups and downs. One night, as we stood together watching our baby sleep, Matt said, "This feels like everything we've been working toward." "It does," I agreed, leaning into him. "And I'm so glad we didn't give up." As the years went on, Matt and I continued to embrace new challenges and opportunities, always with the understanding that our relationship was the foundation of everything we built. We celebrated milestones big and small, from our child's first steps to the day we finally finished the garden we'd always dreamed of planting. And through it all, we never stopped dreaming, never stopped working to create a life that felt meaningful and full. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Matt turned to me and said, "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" "All the time," I said, smiling. "And I wouldn't change a thing." "Me neither," he said, taking my hand. In that moment, I realized that the journey we'd taken, the pain, the growth, the love, had led us to a life that was richer and more fulfilling than I'd ever imagined. We weren't perfect, but we were strong. And together, we knew we could face whatever the future held. The years after our child's birth felt like a new chapter, not just in our marriage, but in the life we were creating as a family. There was a sense of peace in the chaos, a rhythm to the sleepless nights and endless diaper changes that somehow felt fulfilling. Matt and I had found a balance that worked, and the foundation we'd rebuilt proved strong enough to weather even the most challenging days. But as we watched our child grow, our focus shifted again. We began to think about the kind of legacy we wanted to leave, the lessons we hoped to impart, and the life we wanted to build for the future. One of the most profound lessons Matt and I had learned was the power of small, intentional moments. One rainy afternoon, we sat in the living room building a pillow fort with our child. The room was a mess, the laundry was piling up, and the to-do list for the day had long since been abandoned. But in that moment, none of it mattered. "This is the good stuff," Matt said, laughing as our child giggled uncontrollably under the fort. "It really is," I replied, feeling a deep sense of contentment. These moments reminded us that a legacy isn't just about big milestones, it's about the love and joy you create in the everyday. As parents, Matt and I were intentional about modeling the values we wanted to pass on: resilience, kindness, and the importance of connection. One evening, as we sat around the dinner table, our child asked, "How did you and Daddy meet?" Matt and I exchanged a glance, both smiling. "We met over spilled coffee," I said. "And we've been cleaning up messes together ever since." It wasn't the whole story, of course, but it was the essence of who we were, a team that faced challenges together and found joy in the process. Life continued to throw curveballs our way, but Matt and I approached them with the confidence that came from knowing we could handle anything together. When Matt decided to pursue a career change, leaving the corporate world to start his own photography business, it was a leap of faith for both of us. "Are you sure about this?" I asked one evening as we discussed the logistics. "I am," he said. "But only because I know I have you by my side." Supporting Matt in his dream felt like a way of repaying the strength he'd shown me during my lowest moments. As our child grew older, Matt and I began to talk about expanding our family. The decision wasn't one we took lightly, but the thought of adding to the love we'd already built filled us with excitement. When we welcomed our second child into the world, the joy was overwhelming. Watching Matt with our children, I felt a renewed sense of gratitude for the life we'd created, a life that was far from perfect but full of love and purpose. As the years went on, Matt and I continued to prioritize our relationship. We celebrated anniversaries with quiet getaways, carved out time for date nights, and found new ways to surprise each other with little acts of kindness. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Matt turned to me and said, "Do you realize we've built something incredible?" I do, I said, smiling. And I couldn't have done it without you. His words reminded me that a legacy isn't just about what you leave behind, it's about the love you cultivate every day. Looking back, I often thought about how far we'd come. The pain of my betrayal, the effort it took to rebuild trust, and the lessons we learned along the way had all shaped us into the couple we were now. We weren't perfect, but we were resilient. And that resilience had become the foundation of the legacy we were building, a legacy of love, forgiveness, and growth. As Matt and I watched our children play in the yard one summer evening, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known was possible. The journey we'd taken wasn't easy, but it was worth every step. We've done pretty well, haven't we? Matt said, his arm around my shoulders. We have, I agreed, smiling. And I can't wait to see what's next. In that moment, I realized that the future wasn't something to fear, it was something to embrace. Together, we could handle anything, and that knowledge filled me with hope. Years later, as we sat at a family dinner surrounded by laughter, stories, and the life we'd built, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. The journey wasn't perfect, but it was ours. And in the end, that was enough. Matt raised his glass in a toast. To love, to family, and to never giving up, he said. To never giving up, I echoed, my heart full. And as I looked around the table, I knew that our legacy wasn't just something we'd leave behind, it was something we were living every day.